The universe, in its infinite wisdom and questionable sense of humor, had decided that the best way to foster interspecies cooperation was to throw a bunch of teenagers from different worlds into the same academic facility and hope for the best. The Nexus Prime Academy for Interspecies Excellence stood as a gleaming testament to this cosmic joke, its crystalline spires reaching toward the stars like fingers of some particularly ambitious deity, with a degree in architecture and a minor in species integration. Within these hallowed halls, where the air itself was regulated to accommodate 17 different respiratory systems, the great experiment of galactic unity played out in ways that would have made the Academy's founders weep into their ceremonial chalices. Which is to say, it played out exactly like any other school, complete with cliques, bullies, and the sort of casual cruelty that made one question whether civilization was truly an evolutionary advantage. Zephyr Critic represented everything the Academy's brochures promised their students would become: sophisticated, cultured, and possessed of that particular brand of confidence that came from never having been told no by anyone who mattered. His Valaxian heritage showed in the elegant curve of his cranial ridges and the way his skin shifted through subtle hues of blue and silver when he was particularly pleased with himself, which was most of the time. At 19 standard years, he had already mastered 3 forms of diplomatic discourse, could recite the genealogies of 47 noble houses, and had perfected the art of making lesser beings feel appropriately lesser without technically violating any Academy conduct codes. The Academy's student body was arranged in what the administration tactfully called cultural learning groups, and what everyone else recognized as a rigid social hierarchy based on their species' galactic standing. The Valaxians naturally occupied the apex, followed by the Zephyrians with their crystalline intellects, then the Karate with their mathematical precision, and so on down through the ranks until you reached the scholarship students from the outer rim worlds, those quaint little planets that still thought violence was an acceptable solution to problems. Earth fell somewhere near the bottom of this particular food chain, classified as a developing civilization with primitive social structures and concerning aggressive tendencies. The fact that humans had managed to achieve interstellar travel at all was considered something of an amusing fluke by the galactic academic community, rather like a particularly clever pet learning to open doors. Which brought us to Luna Voss, the Academy's lone human exchange student, who had arrived 3 months ago with all the fanfare typically reserved for the delivery of new laboratory equipment. She was unremarkable in the way that humans generally were: average height by galactic standards, peculiar forward-facing eyes, and that odd habit of showing her teeth when she was supposedly expressing pleasure. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore the standard Academy uniform with the same casual indifference she applied to most things. What made Luna interesting, at least to Zephyr, was her complete lack of reaction to his carefully crafted social maneuvers. When he made subtle comments about her species' intellectual limitations, she simply nodded and continued reading. When he arranged for her to be seated at the remedial species table during formal dinners, she ate her food without complaint. When he had his dorm mate Q accidentally spill corrosive cleaning solution on her project notes, she simply started over. This was not how things were supposed to work. Lesser beings were meant to recognize their place in the cosmic order, preferably with some entertaining displays of frustration or despair. Luna's calm acceptance of her circumstances was both baffling and infuriating, like a mathematical equation that refused to balance properly. "Perhaps she's simply too primitive to understand what's happening," suggested Kix during one of their evening strategy sessions. The orange-scaled Draknari had latched onto Zephyr's social coattails early in their academic career and had been riding them ever since, providing loyalty in exchange for reflected status. "I've heard that humans have difficulty with abstract concepts." Zephyr's skin shifted through contemplative purples as he considered this. "No, there's definitely intelligence there, limited certainly, but present. She scored adequately on the placement examinations, and Professor Thane seems to think she has potential in theoretical physics." "Then why doesn't she fight back? Even the Karathi show some spine when pressed." "That," Zephyr said, his ridges rising in what passed for a smile among his kind, "is exactly what we're going to find out." The escalation began subtly, as these things often did. Zephyr's prank started with the sort of minor irritations that could be dismissed as accidents or misunderstandings. Luna's meal selections were mysteriously altered to include foods that human digestive systems couldn't process. Her dormitory room's environmental controls were adjusted to create temperature fluctuations that would have been uncomfortable for most species, but merely annoying for a human. Her study materials were relocated to increasingly obscure locations throughout the academy. Through it all, Luna maintained her maddeningly serene demeanor. She ate what was edible, ignored what wasn't, wrapped herself in additional layers when her room grew cold, and always somehow managed to retrieve her materials in time for classes. She never complained, never showed frustration, never provided the satisfying display of distress that would have validated Zephyr's efforts. Professor Thane, the Academy's senior instructor in applied physics and the closest thing Luna had to a faculty advocate, occasionally inquired about her adjustment to Academy life. She would respond with polite platitudes about finding the experience educational and broadening her perspective, which could have meant anything or nothing at all. "She's playing some sort of game," Zephyr confided to his inner circle during their weekly gathering in the Academy's observation deck. The transparent aluminum walls offered a spectacular view of the nebula that surrounded Nexus Prime, but Zephyr's attention was focused on the human sitting alone at a corner table, 3 levels below, quietly working through what appeared to be advanced quantum mechanics problems. No species endures this level of social pressure without some form of response. "Maybe she's planning revenge," offered Nixala, a Zephyrian whose crystalline features reflected the nebula's colors in fascinating patterns. "I've heard that primitive species can be quite vindictive when provoked." "Impossible," Zephyr said, though something in his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "Humans are classified as emotionally volatile but strategically limited. If she were planning something, we'd have detected it by now." The truth was that Zephyr was becoming obsessed with Luna's lack of reaction in a way that was beginning to interfere with his other pursuits. His diplomatic theory grades had slipped slightly, and he'd actually forgotten to attend a cultural superiority seminar the previous week. This was unacceptable on multiple levels, not least because it suggested that a primitive species was somehow gaining psychological leverage over a superior being. The solution clearly was to escalate until Luna's primitive emotional responses finally overwhelmed her limited self-control. The pranks became more elaborate, more public, and more difficult to dismiss as coincidental. Luna's presentation materials were corrupted hours before major assignments. Her personal belongings were relocated to increasingly embarrassing locations. Her attempts to socialize with other students were subtly sabotaged through careful manipulation of social dynamics. Still, nothing. Luna adapted, improvised, and carried on with the same calm efficiency that was beginning to make Zephyr question fundamental assumptions about species hierarchies. The breaking point came during the 4th month of the academic term, when Zephyr decided that subtlety was clearly wasted on primitive minds. If Luna couldn't appreciate the elegant artistry of his previous efforts, perhaps she would respond better to something more direct. The Academy's main hall during lunch period was the perfect venue for what Zephyr had begun thinking of as his masterpiece. The vast space was filled with students from dozens of species, all arranged in their carefully maintained social clusters. The acoustics were excellent, the lighting was dramatic, and most importantly, everyone would be watching. Zephyr had spent weeks preparing his final gambit, studying human physiology and psychology with the dedication he usually reserved for diplomatic protocols. Humans, according to the Galactic databases, were particularly sensitive to public humiliation and physical discomfort. Their primitive social structures made them dependent on peer approval, and their fragile skeletal systems made them vulnerable to even minor gravitational fluctuations. The plan was elegantly simple. Luna would enter the hall, approach her usual table, and find herself suddenly subject to a localized gravity field that would increase incrementally until she was forced to her knees in front of the entire student body. The effect would be uncomfortable but not dangerous. Zephyr wasn't a savage after all, and would finally provoke the sort of emotional breakdown that would restore the natural order of things. He positioned himself at a table with optimal viewing angles, surrounded by his usual admirers and with Keeks managing the gravity manipulation device from a discreet distance. The timing had to be perfect. Luna would need to be far enough from any tables to avoid injury when she inevitably collapsed, but close enough to the center of the hall to ensure maximum visibility. Luna entered the hall precisely on schedule, moving with that peculiar human gait that always looked slightly unstable to species more accustomed to dignified locomotion. She wore her standard academy uniform and carried a simple meal tray, apparently unaware that she was about to become the star of the most entertaining lunchtime performance in recent memory. Zephyr's skin shifted through anticipatory golds as Luna approached the designated area. Around him, conversations gradually quieted as other students sensed that something interesting was about to happen. The Academy's social ecosystem was finely tuned to detect drama, and Zephyr's preparations hadn't gone entirely unnoticed. Now, he murmured to Keeks, who activated the gravity manipulation device with the reverent precision of an artist unveiling a masterpiece. Luna took 3 more steps, paused, and looked directly at Zephyr with an expression that might have been mild curiosity. Then she did something that would fundamentally alter the social dynamics of the Nexus Prime Academy for the remainder of the academic year. She smiled. Not the polite, slightly confused expression that humans typically wore when attempting to navigate galactic social protocols, but something that revealed altogether too many teeth and suggested that Luna had been waiting for exactly this moment for quite some time. What happened next would be dissected in incident reports, psychological evaluations, and medical journals for years to come. The gravity field, designed to gradually increase until Luna was forced into a submissive position, was met with the sort of adaptive response that suggested human physiology had been somewhat understudied by galactic xenobiologists. Luna's legs bent slightly to accommodate the increased gravitational pressure, her spine compressed in a way that would have been crippling to most species, and she continued walking toward Zephyr's table with the same unhurried pace she'd maintained throughout the entire semester. The meal tray in her hands never wavered, even as the gravity field reached levels that should have been crushing her primitive skeletal structure. "Increase the field strength," Zephyr hissed to Keeks, his skin flashing through alarmed oranges as his carefully planned humiliation began to collapse around him. "It's already at maximum safe levels," Keeks replied, his orange scales pale with confusion. "Any higher and we risk damaging the Academy's structural integrity." Luna reached their table, set down her tray with the same careful precision she applied to all her actions, and looked at Zephyr with those unsettling forward-facing eyes that suddenly seemed far more predatory than he'd previously realized. "Thank you," she said in her quiet, unremarkable voice. "I've been wondering when you'd finally work up the courage to try something direct." The gravity field collapsed as Keeks' concentration failed, leaving the main hall in a silence that was broken only by the gentle hum of the Academy's environmental systems. Every student in the vicinity was staring at their table, and Zephyr was beginning to realize that his masterpiece had somehow become a public demonstration of his own incompetence. "I don't know what you mean," he said, his voice carrying only slightly more conviction than he actually felt. "The gravity systems must be malfunctioning." Luna's smile widened, revealing even more teeth than seemed strictly necessary for proper nutrition. "Oh, I think you know exactly what I mean. You've been trying to break me for months, and I've been letting you because I was curious about your methods. But this?" She gestured toward the gravity manipulation device that Keeks was trying unsuccessfully to hide. "This is actually dangerous. Someone could have been hurt." "You're being ridiculous," Zephyr said, his skin shifting through defensive purples. "Even if I were responsible, which I'm not, you're hardly in a position to do anything about it." "Am I not?" Luna asked, and something in her tone made Zephyr's survival instincts finally activate with all the urgency they should have been showing for the past several months. The thing about humans, as Zephyr was about to learn in the most educational way possible, was that their classification as a primitive species was based primarily on their political and social structures. Their individual capabilities had been somewhat overlooked in the assessment process, partly because humans had a tendency to downplay their own abilities, and partly because the galactic academic community had a regrettable habit of confusing civilized with harmless. Luna moved across the table with a speed that Zephyr's enhanced Valaxian reflexes were entirely unprepared for. One moment she was sitting peacefully on the opposite side of the table, and the next she was standing directly in front of him, with her hand wrapped around his throat in a grip that was both gentle and absolutely terrifying. "Let me tell you something about Earth," she said conversationally, as if she weren't currently demonstrating that human fingers were apparently strong enough to crush Valaxian windpipes. "We didn't develop interstellar travel because we're particularly clever, though we're not stupid. We developed it because we needed to get off our planet before it killed us." Zephyr tried to respond, but discovered that his vocal cords were no longer receiving the cooperation they required from his respiratory system. Around them, the main hall had erupted into the sort of chaos that occurred when carefully maintained social hierarchies suddenly revealed themselves to be based on incomplete information. "You see," Luna continued, her grip tightening just enough to make her point, "Earth is what the galactic community politely calls a death world. Everything on our planet is actively trying to kill us, from the weather to the wildlife to the geology itself. We don't have the luxury of being civilized in the way that you understand civilization. We have to be survivors first, and everything else second." She released her grip on Zephyr's throat, allowing him to collapse back into his chair with a gasping sound that was deeply undignified. But before he could recover enough to speak, Luna's other hand shot out and grabbed his wrist, holding it against the table with casual strength that made Zephyr's enhanced musculature seem like a quaint affectation. "The gravity field you used against me," Luna said, her voice never rising above conversational levels despite the fact that she was apparently capable of breaking bones with her bare hands, "that's about half the gravitational force I grew up with. The temperature fluctuations in my room, those are more comfortable than summer weather in most of Earth's inhabited regions. The psychological pressure you've been applying, that's adorable compared to what human teenagers do to each other for entertainment." Zephyr's worldview, carefully constructed over 19 years of galactic education and species superiority, was crumbling with the efficiency of a controlled demolition. "You're bluffing," he managed to whisper, though his voice lacked any conviction whatsoever. Luna's smile became somehow even more unsettling. "Am I?" What followed was less a fight than a comprehensive educational experience in the practical applications of human adaptability. Zephyr, despite his enhanced physiology and superior breeding, found himself being systematically dismantled by someone who treated violence with the same casual competence that she applied to quantum mechanics homework. Luna didn't move like the other species in the academy, with their dignified poses and carefully controlled gestures. She moved like something that had evolved in an environment where hesitation was fatal and mercy was a luxury that survival couldn't afford. Every motion was economical, precise, and devastatingly effective. When Zephyr tried to use his superior reach to keep her at a distance, she simply stepped inside his guard and demonstrated that human elbows were apparently designed for close-quarters combat. When he attempted to use his enhanced strength to overpower her, she showed him that leverage was more important than raw power and that human joints bent in ways that Valaxian anatomy couldn't accommodate. The most disturbing part from Zephyr's perspective was that Luna never seemed particularly angry or emotional. She approached the systematic destruction of his dignity with the same calm efficiency she'd shown throughout the semester, as if breaking his nose was simply another problem to be solved through practical application of known principles. "The thing about bullies," Luna said as she pinned Zephyr's arm behind his back in a position that was teaching him entirely too much about human skeletal flexibility, "is that they only pick on people they think can't fight back. You spent months studying human psychology, but you never bothered to learn about human physiology. That was a mistake." By the time Professor Thane arrived to restore order, Zephyr was discovering that his species' rapid healing abilities were entirely inadequate for dealing with the sort of comprehensive physical education that Luna had been providing. His left eye was swollen shut, his nose was pointing in a direction that anatomy textbooks would have described as inadvisable, and several of his cranial ridges had been rearranged in ways that would require extensive medical intervention to correct. Luna, meanwhile, was sitting calmly at the table where this had all began, finishing her lunch with the same methodical precision she applied to everything else. The only indication that she'd been involved in any sort of physical altercation was a slight dishevelment of her hair and what appeared to be a small amount of Valaxian blood on her knuckles. "Miss Voss," Professor Thane said in the carefully neutral tone that Academy faculty used when they were trying to avoid taking sides in interspecies conflicts, "would you care to explain what happened here?" Luna looked up from her meal, her expression returning to the polite, slightly confused demeanor that had characterized her entire time at the Academy. "Zephyr was demonstrating Valaxian martial arts techniques," she said helpfully. "I was showing him some human self-defense methods in return. It was very educational." Professor Thane's gaze moved to Zephyr, who was being supported by two medical technicians and making sounds that might have been attempts at speech. "Mr. Kriathak, is this an accurate description of events?" Zephyr tried to respond, but discovered that his facial injuries had left him temporarily unable to form coherent words. This was probably for the best. as his first instinct had been to demand Luna's immediate expulsion for assault, and he was beginning to realize that such a demand might raise uncomfortable questions about his own behavior over the past several months. "I see," Professor Thane said, his tone suggesting that he saw considerably more than he was prepared to discuss in public. "Miss Voss, perhaps you could join me in my office after lunch to discuss your educational techniques. Mr. Krethek, I believe you should report to the medical bay for evaluation." As the crowd of students gradually dispersed, their conversations buzzing with excitement and speculation, Luna returned to her lunch with the same calm focus she'd maintained throughout the entire incident. The social dynamics of the academy had shifted fundamentally in the space of 10 minutes, but she seemed no more concerned with her new status than she had been with her previous position at the bottom of the hierarchy. Word of the incident spread through the academy's social networks, with the speed typically reserved for natural disasters and examination schedule changes. By evening, every student in the facility knew that the quiet human had systematically demolished one of the most prominent members of the Valaxian nobility, and that she'd done it with the casual efficiency of someone solving a particularly straightforward mathematics problem. The medical bay's report on Zephyr's injuries became legendary among the student body, not least because it required the Academy's xenobiologists to conduct emergency research into human combat capabilities. The resulting documentation would eventually be distributed to every educational facility in the Galactic community, along with revised guidelines for human student integration. Luna, meanwhile, found herself experiencing the sort of social rehabilitation that occurred when an entire institution suddenly realized they'd been operating under dangerously incomplete information. Students who had previously ignored her now went out of their way to be polite. Faculty members began treating her contributions to class discussions with considerably more respect. Even the dining hall staff seemed to put extra effort into ensuring that her meals were properly prepared. The transformation was so complete that it took Luna several days to realize that she'd somehow become the Academy's most feared student without actually doing anything to cultivate that reputation. Her study groups were now populated by students who seemed genuinely interested in her insights rather than merely tolerating her presence. Her dormitory neighbors had begun asking for her opinion on various matters, as if her perspective might be valuable rather than merely quaint. Professor Thane's discussion about her educational techniques turned out to be less disciplinary hearing and more intelligence briefing. The Academy's administration had apparently spent considerable time over the past few months wondering why their human exchange students seemed so remarkably well adapted to Academy life, and Luna's demonstration had provided some uncomfortable answers. "We may have made certain assumptions about human capabilities based on incomplete data," Professor Thane admitted during their private meeting. "Your species' classification as developing appears to have been based primarily on political and technological factors rather than individual abilities." "That's probably accurate," Luna agreed. "We're not particularly advanced compared to most galactic civilizations, but we're extremely good at not dying. It's a survival skill that translates well to most environments." "Indeed. I trust that you won't find it necessary to provide any additional educational demonstrations." Luna's smile was considerably less unsettling when it wasn't accompanied by the systematic destruction of social hierarchies. "Only if someone gives me a reason to. I'm here to learn, not to fight. But I'm good at both." Zephyr's recovery took 3 weeks, during which he had ample time to contemplate the various ways in which his understanding of the universe had been fundamentally incorrect. The medical procedures required to restore his facial features to their original configuration were extensive, expensive, and served as a daily reminder that assumptions about species capabilities could be dangerously misleading. His return to classes was marked by a profound change in his approach to interspecies relations. The casual arrogance that had characterized his previous behavior was replaced by a wariness that his classmates found both amusing and instructive. He no longer made subtle comments about species hierarchies, no longer orchestrated social dynamics for his own entertainment, and most certainly no longer engaged in what he'd previously considered harmless pranks. The scar that ran along his left cheekbone, a permanent reminder of Luna's educational techniques, became something of a cautionary tale among the student body. Faculty members began using the incident as a case study in the importance of comprehensive cultural research, and the Academy's xenobiology department received significant funding increases to prevent similar misunderstandings in the future. Luna, for her part, returned to her quiet study routine with the same methodical focus she'd maintained throughout the entire semester. She attended her classes, completed her assignments, and participated in the Academy's social activities with the same polite engagement she'd shown from the beginning. The only difference was that now, when she smiled, other students smiled back with genuine warmth, rather than condescending tolerance. The universe, in its infinite wisdom and questionable sense of humor, had once again demonstrated that the most important lessons were rarely found in official curricula. The Nexus Prime Academy for Interspecies Excellence had set out to teach its students about galactic cooperation and cultural understanding, and it had succeeded beyond its founders' wildest expectations. It had just done so in a way that required significantly more medical insurance than originally anticipated. The final examinations came and went with considerably less drama than the midterm period had provided. Luna's scores placed her in the top 15% of her class, achievement that surprised no one who had actually been paying attention, but caused considerable consternation among those who had been operating under outdated assumptions about human intellectual capability. At the end of term celebration, as students from across the galaxy gathered to commemorate their shared educational experience, Luna found herself surrounded by classmates who seemed genuinely interested in her perspective on galactic affairs. The conversations were engaging, the food was properly prepared for human consumption, and the overall atmosphere was considerably more pleasant than it had been during her first few months at the Academy. Zephyr, nursing a drink that was specifically formulated to be compatible with Valaxian neurology, watched the proceedings from a respectful distance. His facial reconstruction had been successful, but the scar remained visible as a permanent reminder of the day he'd learned that intelligence and civilization were not necessarily equivalent to physical harmlessness. "Regrets?" asked Kix, who had spent the past several months carefully distancing himself from his former patron's more questionable activities. Zephyr touched the scar reflexively, a gesture that had become habitual over the past few weeks. "Only that it took me so long to realize what should have been obvious from the beginning, which is that any species capable of achieving interstellar travel without destroying itself in the process is probably more dangerous than their diplomatic classification suggests." Across the room, Luna was explaining some aspect of Earth's ecosystem to a fascinated group of xenobiology students, her quiet voice carrying the same calm authority that had characterized her entire time at the Academy. She looked exactly as unremarkable as she had on the day she'd arrived, except for the subtle difference in how everyone around her was listening. The universe, as it turned out, had an excellent sense of irony. Zephyr had spent months trying to provoke a reaction from the Academy's most dangerous student, and he'd finally succeeded. He'd just gotten considerably more reaction than he'd bargained for, delivered in a way that had permanently altered his understanding of what constituted civilized behavior. As the celebration continued around them, Professor Thane made a mental note to revise the Academy's orientation materials to include a more comprehensive section on species capability assessments. The incident had been educational for everyone involved, but it had also highlighted some significant gaps in their institutional knowledge that would need to be addressed before the next academic year. The most important lesson, he reflected, was that the universe was far too complex and dangerous to make assumptions about anyone's capabilities based on their species' political development. Civilization, as it turned out, was less about the absence of violence and more about the wisdom to know when violence was necessary and when it was merely convenient. Luna Voss had demonstrated both qualities in abundance, and the Nexus Prime Academy for Interspecies Excellence was a better educational institution for having experienced her particular brand of practical philosophy. Whether it was a safer institution was a question that would be debated by administrators for years to come, but safety, as Luna had proven, was often a matter of perspective. The galaxy, in all its infinite complexity, had once again proven that the most valuable lessons were rarely the ones found in textbooks, and that the most dangerous individuals were often the ones who seemed the most harmless. It was a lesson that would serve the Academy's students well in their future careers, assuming they were wise enough to remember it. And in the end, that was perhaps the most important education of all.